And just to remind you that the scheme was introduced in steps and it came into full effect in 2004. And that's why the number of days varies at the beginning. But what is, of course, most important when we look at the average number of days is that the fathers do not use the joint rights, but only their non-transferable 3 months, which has been discussed earlier in the conference. But it's very easy to say that it was an instant success, the parental leave scheme. But why did Iceland introduce such a radical measure, and how was it possible? I'll now turn to the short historical overview. The idea of some form of leave for fathers had been proposed in different quarters for decades. It was first mentioned publicly in Iceland at a conference held in 1975 to mark the United Nations Year of the Woman, where 1 or 2 weeks of leave for fathers was suggested by a group of women. The Women's Alliance, an all-female political party active from 1983 to 1999, put forward numerous bills for maternity and paternity leave, but without success. In 1993, the so-called Men's Committee, a working group on behalf of the Minister of Social Affairs, put forward a demand for a separate leave for fathers. In 1998, the Icelandic Federation of Labour, Iceland's largest trade union, called for paid paternity leave. And the same demand came from other labor unions as well, as the employers' associations. And the first serious attempt to introduce paternity leave in practice was taken by the city of Reykjavík in 1996 to 1998 with a pilot project funded by the European Union. And I think we're going to discuss that in the next session. There are, of course, several reasons behind the specific path taken in Iceland in the 2000 reform. One reason is that the existing system was a poorly functioning patchwork of measures. It was a parsimonious system with rather limited rights, even for those groups of women who were best covered. Hence, when the new reform was introduced, it benefited all concerned. Another reason was an increasing emphasis on men in the gender equality discourse. This emphasis is clearly reflected in the policy documents as well as in the general discourse. One of the core aims of the parental leave legislation was to strengthen the bond between men and their children, and the second aim was to strengthen women's status in the labor market. A third reason for the specific path taken in Iceland, and in line with what I discussed in my introduction, was Iceland's opportunity to take the lead in the matter, to be the first with the most generous rights for men. This is very well reflected in the parliamentary debates. So, do we find in the Icelandic legislation a roadmap for total equality, as suggested in my title? I'll now discuss pitfalls in the progressive and some suggestions for the future. As you all might know, in October 2008, the Icelandic banks collapsed and the Icelandic government sought financial aid from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Following these dramatic events, the state had to drastically cut its expenditure, the parental leave fund included, I'm sad to say. And as a consequence, the law on parental leave was changed. Leave can now be utilized until the child is 3 years old, and this was done to lower the amount of money needed each year to finance the parental leave scheme. The ceiling on payment was also lowered quite considerably, from 3,400 euros a month to 1,900 euros a month. So the burning question, of course, is what effect will this have on fathers' take-up rates and number of days? Unfortunately, we don't have the answers yet because the period leave can be utilized is 3 years, so we will not have information for children born in 2009 until next year. But according to some clues we have gathered, some preliminary data, there is some that say that fathers are now using fewer days than before, and that even fewer fathers than before are utilizing any of their leave. And this, of course, is a very serious concern. But without hard data, it's difficult to respond and take action. So we'll just have to wait in the trenches until 2013. As for suggestions for future developments, I think it is very important to set a higher ceiling on payments, comparable to the ceiling before the economic crisis, and to lengthen the leave to 1 year, 6 plus 6, 6 months for mothers and 6 months for fathers. I think it's also very important to do more research regularly on the take-up of fathers, how they use their time while on leave, and to start monitoring the long-term effects of the policy. For example, is the bond between fathers and children strengthened? Have women strengthened their position in the labor market since the legislation was passed, and so on. These were the primary aims of the legislation, but we have very little empirical evidence to test these aims and whether they have been fulfilled in any way. So, now I'll turn to the last section of my talk to conclude. Non-transferable, fully paid parental leave for both parents is, of course, not a quick fix solution, but, and the but is very important, so I will say it for the third time, but it is one of the main foundations of gender-equal society. Men and women need to share the care, and as I've illustrated, well-thought-out schemes can easily come under attack, so we need to be constantly on guard, and there is never a once and for all when it comes to gender equality. I started my talk by telling you about Þóra Arnórsdóttir and how Icelanders could once again write history by democratically electing a breastfeeding president with a stay-at-home male partner fathering. So, does Þóra's story have a happy ending? Her campaign was very well received in the beginning, and an opinion poll at the end of April showed that she had support from almost 50% of the population, while the sitting president, Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, had around 35% support. Despite a head start, Þóra's support has, according to the opinion polls, diminished in recent weeks. My theory is that Icelanders surely welcomed the idea of a pregnant presidential candidate to vote for a glowing, fresh-faced woman, but they are maybe not as ready to vote for a woman who has just given birth. Anti-feminism and xenophobia seem to be on the rise all over Europe. Part of the anti-feminist discourse, as discussed earlier here today, is the mother discourse. Mothers should stay at home and care for the children. That is their natural role in life, according to the anti-feminist discourse. Another strand of the anti-feminist discourse is that men who take on what is typically the woman's role must be unmanly or feminine in some way, or that they are disguising themselves as feminists because they have some ulterior motives. They want to score with the ladies, but are not being sincere or genuine in their pro-feminist claims and actions. No one has suggested that Svavar Halldórsson, Þóra's partner, is not a real man. It's a difficult claim to make, not only because of his George Clooney looks, but because he's been in the front line as a hardcore reporter since the Icelandic banks collapsed. But instead, he is being portrayed as a man with ulterior motives, disguised as a sheep, a violent man with what seems little sound evidence. I, of course, voted in the pre-election voting before coming to Madrid. And since I'm not only here as an academic, but also a feminist activist, you must have figured out whom I voted for. So I'm keeping all my fingers crossed for Þóra and her stay-at-home partner. And I think this is very important, and I'll explain why. Oops. Just take a quick breath. Oops. So, I'll explain why. My generation grew up with a female president. The following generation did not. My generation is more gender equality minded than the following generation, according to a recent research in Iceland. And this has been explained, among others, by us having the female president and the feminist political party. Having a stay-at-home dad putting his career on hold for his female partner will be an inspiration for this generation and following generations. And it can refuel the parental leave discussion in a time of a backlash. Men are not bound to be breadwinners, and they can find fulfillment in other demanding roles without losing any of their masculinity. As we say in the feminist circles, real men are feminists, and real men love feminists. This means that real men take care of children to the same degree as women, and that is our roadmap towards gender equality. Gracias.